Welcome to the last talk from this Haast Symposium. We're joined now by Sascha Nolden, Dr. Sascha Nolden, who is the research librarian at the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, New Zealand. His research interests are into the 19th century letters and diaries of especially New Zealand scientists, and he's been primarily involved in the transcription and translation of these primary sources, and especially his work with the Haast collection, which he curates at the Alexander Turnbull Library, has been especially relevant to this symposium. His contributions to Haast scholarship include editions of Correspondence, and he also prepared the New Zealand UNESCO Memory of the World bid, which resulted in the Haast Correspondence receiving a Memory of the World registration, which is a highly successful operation. So I will now pass you on to Sascha, who will be talking about the correspondence of Sir Julius von Haast.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Sascha Nolden, and I'm a research librarian at the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington. My paper is on the correspondence of Sir Julius von Haast. The correspondence of Sir Julius von Haast. Sir Julius von Haast was an amazingly prolific correspondent. He wrote letters in English, French, and German. And all of the extant inward correspondence is held in one collection. However, there are no letter books, carbon copies, or draft of outward correspondence. Haast's handwriting is highly distinctive and consistent in style, making it recognizable. Inward letters from approximately 700 correspondents are held in the collection. Correspondence represents scientific networking in the 19th century. Haast is the most famous German-born New Zealand scientist of the 19th century, and probably one of the most decorated scientists in New Zealand of all time. The importance of the Haast collection was recognized in 2019 when it was inscribed in the New Zealand Register of the UNESCO Memory of the World. The Sir Julius von Haast collection, the Alexander Turnbull Library, includes series of correspondence. The correspondence in the collection is largely inward correspondence, but there are also some family letters, letters Haast wrote to his wife and children at times when he was traveling, including overseas. And then there are also letters which I'm describing as the autograph collection. These are letters Haast collected, but addressed to others. Letters represent an important medium of communication. They served as a networking tool, and letter writing in the 19th century followed conventions and formats. Letters represent personal records. They are intellectual entities. They are archival entities and fascinating physical objects. And today, we are often working with digital surrogates. This enables access and helps preserve the originals. When we start looking at Haast's letters, we find there is a whole group of letters that have been published at one time or another. So reviewing this largely in chronological order, we begin with those letters that were published during Haast's lifetime. Most of these were published in newspapers or journals, cited in books and other publications. And most interesting and telling at times are those letters addressed to the editor of newspapers, beginning from his early period in New Zealand. For example, when he was in the province of Nelson, he began addressing his views and concerns in the letters to the editor. Other letters take the form of being notes and communications, reporting on the latest discoveries and findings based on his field research and scientific endeavors. Then we look at those published posthumously. The letters, as part of the family papers, were inherited by Haast's son, Heinrich Ferdinand von Haast, who first started looking at them as evidence of his father's life and work. He prepared letters between Haast and Sir Joseph Hooker at Kew Gardens, and this was published as a special article in the press. Then Heinrich von Haast began work on his monumental biography, later to be published as The Life and Times of Sir Julius von Haast in 1948. The Life and Times comprises more than 1,000 pages of text, and about a third of this text is based on the letters, the correspondence held by Heinrich von Haast at the time. These primary source documents were his primary source for piecing together the relationships that his father had with scientific colleagues all around the world. Then we find occasionally letters surfaced and were published in newspapers and formed the basis of newspaper articles. But most of the publications of letters are represented in this one monumental work by Heinrich Ferdinand von Haast, in which there are more than 100 letters, either quoted in full or cited in excerpt, including those that are paraphrased in translation. Once Heinrich Ferdinand von Haast had finished his work on Haast, he began to deposit the papers with the Alexander Turnbull Library. So between 1948 and the death of Heinrich von Haast in 1953, the papers, as part of the larger Sir Julius von Haast collection, came to the Alexander Turnbull Library, where they've been archived and preserved. It's interesting to now look at the scholarly engagement with this collection over the past 70 years, looking especially at the letters. Letters have been regularly cited as part of scholarly papers and articles. Letters were published as editions of correspondence, and projects to publish correspondence have included both analog and digital format outputs. More recently, letters have been published as part of online databases. Simon Nathan's Correspondence project was the largest undertaking of its kind for research into the history of science in New Zealand. Simon Nathan took it upon himself to research Sir James Hector and prepare a biography published in 2015, and look at Hector's relationships with his contemporaries. As part of this project, more than 1,000 letters were transcribed and published. The project resulted in 13 published volumes, including 10 volumes of letters in both print and digital format. And 5 of these volumes feature Haast correspondence. Other editions, including letters by Haast, most notably the Charles Darwin Correspondence Project, the Ferdinand von Müller Correspondence Project, and the letters from Eugen von Gerard to Haast, published by Tom Darragh of Melbourne as a special standalone volume called Lieber Freund, Dear Friend. Letters from geologists at the Geological Survey of Austria were published as a paper by myself, along with co-authors, and the correspondence of Haast with Eduard von Suess, an Austrian geologist, were also published by the Geological Survey of Austria. Then more recently, there was a very interesting study on the relationship between Adolf Bernhard Meyer of Dresden Museum and Haast and their exchanges, including detailed descriptions and editions of their correspondence by Christina Schlott. The already mentioned Charles Darwin Correspondence project, which is nearing its conclusion, resulted in the development of a platform, a dedicated database for scientific correspondence of the 19th century at Cambridge University Library called Epsilon. This serves both as a digital repository and an aggregator and finding aid. It hosts metadata from external projects and digital editions of letters. Epsilon already includes over 100 items of Haast correspondence, including letters from Charles and Emma Darwin, Ferdinand von Müller, John Tyndall, and Joseph Hooker. Now I'd like to present to you a proposal for a new project to publish Haast letters, which I'm naming the Haast Bicentenary Edition. The proposed project aims to prepare a new edition of Haast's correspondence. This edition would arrange the letters in subdivisions of the language and sorted by correspondent and chronology, similar to the way the collection has been arranged by the Alexander Turnbull Library. The preparation of such an edition of letters would involve the transcription, translations, annotation, description, and editing. But then there are also the tasks of rights management and permissions, copyright and Creative Commons to be considered. Because we're looking at the 21st century, we would also be looking at formatting and encoding, ideally using an XML-based and TEI version 5 encoding and markup. The publication might then take the form of PDF format and be included in a database such as Epsilon. I was very encouraged by the response which I received to my initial approach to Epsilon and the team at the Cambridge University Library, in which I described the proposed Haast Bicentenary Edition project. Dr. Alison Pearn, Associate Director of the Darwin Correspondence Project, wrote to me on the 22nd of February 2022 saying, "This is exactly the sort of material we are keen to add to Epsilon." Looking at the tasks involved in preparing an edition of correspondence in more detail, I'm beginning with two of my favorites, the transcription and translation of letters, turning what often seems to be illegible to publishable. This requires some understanding and appreciation of the intricacies of paleography, as the reading of holograph letters in English, French, and German, written by some 700 different people, is a challenge, a most rewarding exercise. Handwriting in the second half of the 19th century, with all its characteristics, idiosyncrasies, particular to the time when the writer was educated and the language they might be writing in. I'm looking at the art of diplomatic transcriptions, establishing conventions for consistency. One of the fascinating aspects is the non-standardized spelling that we find in correspondence from this period, the orthography and the effects of spelling reforms, language usage, archaic usage and meaning. And then in this instance, where required, adding that added layer for access, overcoming the language barrier through translation. Translation is a balancing act between art and science, literal and readable, fidelity to the source language versus the idiomatic rendition in the target language. Transcription and translation is working with holograph letters, often best accomplished through digital surrogates. In the example on the right, we see one of Haast's letters written to his friend Ferdinand von Hochstetter in Vienna. He's dated this, Timaru, on the 13th of February, 1865. Over here, I'm showing excerpts from the letter, the translation and transcription, as an example of the challenges one might expect to meet in completing this project. Another task is the description and annotation. Describing letters and adding annotations is at the very heart of preparing an edition of Correspondence. The descriptions aim to capture metadata, but there's also the physical descriptions, describing the letters as physical objects and adding annotations for context and serving the purposes of indexing. Over here is the summary of a letter by Ferdinand von Müller to Julius von Haast, taken from the Epsilon database, where we can see the essential metadata that allows this correspondence to be added to an aggregator, making it discoverable and usable. Preparing an edition of letters requires a great deal of editing and formatting. The editing role is one both of oversight and project management. But then there's also the more technical elements of formatting, preparing the layout for both digital and analog publication, and encoding, working with an XML text editor, which then facilitates validation of the XML and adding the elements of TEI, Text Encoding Initiative version 5 markup, which at its very simplest level means breaking up the letter transcription into its various components. Using this example of a letter from Julius von Haast to Charles Darwin, again from the Epsilon database, we see that we have the letter. Within the letter, there is the body, and the body comprises an opener, both the opener place name and the opener date. Then there's the salute, and at the end, we have a footnote section and bibliography, which represents the footnotes added for context as part of the annotations in this edition, and the bibliography references where it was first published. Finally, as part of such a project today, we are able to make use of the archival repositories and online finding aids to try and find more Haast letters. Haast letters are scattered all around the world in institutional repositories and private collections. The research value of identifying and publishing Haast letters is enormous, because by finding and locating and publishing the letters from Haast, we're able to bring together the two halves of conversations, hitherto only represented by the inward correspondence in the collections of the Alexander Turnbull Library. In closing, I want to share one of my most recent discoveries. Over here, we have a letter written by Haast to the son of Mozart in the year 1853. At the time, Haast was traveling in Italy, and this letter is dated from Milano, but he also gives his permanent address in Frankfurt am Main. So this is one of those wonderful examples where finding letters that predate his time in New Zealand is able to provide new primary source evidence to increase our understanding of the life of Julius von Haast, thanks to his correspondence. I'm sure that there are many, many more wonderful, fascinating letters by Haast to be discovered out there. And by bringing them back together and making them available in a new edition of letters, adding new research resources for the exploration of the history of science in New Zealand in the 19th century, and celebrating the life and accomplishments of Sir Julius von Haast. Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the support of the Alexander Turnbull Library and thank Canterbury Museum for hosting the Haast Symposium. I would also like to invite you to make contact if you are interested in contributing or supporting the Haast Bicentenary Edition and anyone who knows of holdings of Haast letters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sascha, and also to Matthias. These two presentations really were excellent ways for us to finish off the symposium. They really emphasised the importance of this historical correspondence and also the access to primary sources such as diaries, and really suggested to me, I believe, that there's in fact, although we called Haast's son's biography the final word and our understanding of Haast's life, it does really appear to us that, or to me, that there is indeed a potential for primary research that should really emphasise Haast's life. So thank you to both Sascha and Matthias.